The first time Evelyn Harper saw the Wentworth mansion, she felt as though the earth itself had exhaled something cold beneath her feet. It was the autumn of 1868, 4 years before that infamous Christmas Eve, and Savannah still carried the unsettled quiet of a South learning to live without chains, at least in law, if not in spirit. The house loomed over the marshland like an old sentinel, its white columns stained by humidity, its windows dark and watchful. People said the tides there whispered at night, but Evelyn would later learn it was not the marsh she needed to fear. At 16, she had been sold into domestic labor by distant relatives who barely remembered her name. She arrived with one dress, a letter of recommendation written by a woman who hadn't bothered to read it aloud to her, and a sense that the world was about to fold her into a place that didn't want her but needed her hands. As she stepped through the iron gate, the scent of camellias mixed with the sharper smell of cigar smoke drifting from the porch. Charles Wentworth stood there, the patriarch himself, watching her with the calm, heavy authority of a man certain the world belonged to him. He was tall, with a stiff posture and eyes the color of pewter. His mouth never seemed fully relaxed. It held a kind of permanent displeasure, as though everything before him fell short of his expectations. "You'll keep your head down," he told her without greeting. "My sons don't need distractions." The words felt like a warning, though Evelyn didn't yet know why. Inside, the house swallowed sound. Velvet curtains muffled the echo of footsteps, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways, each expression a judgment. The other maids kept their voices low, their gazes lower still. Ruth, an older woman who managed the kitchen, whispered that the Wentworths had lost land, men, and pride during the war, and that they were determined to recover all three, even if it meant bleeding the people beneath them. But it wasn't Charles who first made Evelyn uneasy. It was his sons. Nathaniel, the eldest, carried the air of a man who believed charm was a currency no one could refuse. He offered gentle smiles that never reached his eyes. Jonah, quieter, watched everyone with unsettling concentration, as though memorizing their weaknesses. Thomas, the third, was reckless, always smelling of whiskey, his temper quick and unpredictable. And Samuel, the youngest, still a boy in some ways, lingered too long in doorways where Evelyn worked, curiosity turning slowly into something heavier. Their glances followed her. Their footsteps seemed to echo behind her even when she was alone. The walls of the mansion held their secrets. Scuffs on floors, scrapes on banisters, hushed arguments behind half-closed doors. Evelyn felt the weight of an invisible net tightening day by day. Yet she worked quietly, moving through the rooms with the caution of someone who knew one wrong gesture could shift the atmosphere. She learned the routines, Charles's demands for perfectly ironed shirts, Nathaniel's obsession with polished boots, Jonah's refusal to let anyone touch his room. She listened more than she spoke and noticed more than they realized. One evening, while cleaning the study, she found a small silver locket tucked behind a stack of ledgers. Inside was a photograph of a woman she didn't recognize, and on the back, an engraving, "To C.W., with everlasting devotion." Something about the message felt intimate, secret. When she asked Ruth about it, the older woman stiffened. "Best forget anything not meant for your eyes," she warned. But her voice trembled, betraying fear. The nights grew heavier. Occasionally, Evelyn heard footsteps in the hallway long after the house should have been asleep. Sometimes she woke to the feeling of someone standing near her room, though when she opened her eyes, the corridor was always empty. The youngest son, Samuel, began leaving small gifts near the kitchen. A ribbon, a polished stone, always without a word. A gesture meant to be kind, perhaps, yet it unsettled her more than outright cruelty. By the winter of 1872, Evelyn could sense a shift in the air, a tension beneath the surface of ordinary days. The Wentworth men had grown more resigned, more irritable, more present in places she wished they wouldn't be. Charles's voice echoed sharper through the walls. Jonah stared at her with a suspicion he never voiced. And Nathaniel. His smile had changed. It looked hungry now. There were moments when Evelyn caught her reflection in the glass panes and barely recognized the woman staring back. A woman carrying something she had not yet named. Something forming quietly, dangerously inside her. And then, one late afternoon, As the sun dipped behind the Spanish moss and the house darkened earlier than it should have, Evelyn heard a door slam upstairs, followed by a voice, Charles's voice, calling her name with an edge she had never heard before. Something told her that crossing that threshold would change everything. When Evelyn reached the top of the staircase, the voice that had summoned her was no longer calling, but the air still throbbed with the residue of it. Charles Wentworth stood in the dim hallway outside his study, a glass of bourbon in one hand, the other pressed against the doorframe as though steadying himself. The late afternoon light carved harsh angles across his face, deepening the lines around his mouth. "You took too long," he said, though she had climbed the stairs the moment she heard him. His tone wasn't irritated. It was searching, as if he were testing the edges of a thought he hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Step inside." The study smelled of tobacco and old leather, but beneath those familiar scents lay something newer, sharper. Attention. Papers were scattered across the desk, ledgers half-opened, inkpots tipped at slight angles. Charles closed the door behind her with a deliberate slowness before leaning against it, blocking the exit in a way that made Evelyn's pulse quicken. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, he stared at the documents on the desk. Numbers, signatures, land deeds. "Everything I built is being stolen," he murmured. "By taxes. By men in Washington who know nothing of my sacrifice. By neighbors who pretend to mourn the Confederacy while clawing for what's left." His voice lowered. "And by people who think they can wander my house, seeing what they shouldn't." Her breath caught, though she kept her expression still. He lifted his eyes to her. "You've been finding things." It wasn't a question. Evelyn's hands tightened around the cleaning cloth she had brought with her as an alibi for being anywhere in the house. "Sir, Charles stepped forward, lifting the silver locket she had found days earlier. The chain dangled between his fingers like a snare. "This is not for the curious." The edge in his voice was not anger but warning, a warning sharpened by fear. "You are to forget you ever saw it." Her silence only seemed to disturb him more. He closed the distance between them, lowering his voice. "This house requires loyalty. Absolute loyalty." The word house felt like a sickness. Evelyn nodded slowly, and only then did he let her leave. But the shift had begun. In the following days, the suns became unpredictable shadows in her routines. Nathaniel appeared wherever she went, offering assistance with a drawer, moving too close as she swept a corner, lingering in the doorway with a smile that had turned decidedly proprietary. Jonah watched both of them with tightened jaws, scribbling in a leather notebook he never let out of sight. Thomas grew more volatile, slamming his fists on tables, muttering about dark days and ungrateful mouths to feed. And Samuel stopped leaving gifts. Instead, he followed her quietly, almost mournfully, like someone listening for a truth he dreaded. The tension inside the mansion thickened until every whisper seemed to echo. Then, one storm-heavy night, Evelyn discovered something that shifted everything again. She had been tasked with fetching linens from a storage room adjacent to the master bedroom. The door jammed slightly, swollen from humidity, and when she forced it open, she saw a wooden crate pushed against the back wall. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded them only enough to understand. Deeds to properties that no longer legally belonged to the Wentworth family. Signatures forged. A record of a loan taken under a false identity. And another document. A ledger tracking payments to men in town whose allegiance Charles was trying to buy back. If discovered, any one of these could lead to imprisonment. All of them, together. Ruin. A floorboard creaked behind her. Evelyn froze. Jonah stood in the doorway, his notebook clutched to his chest, his gaze fixed on the documents in her hands. Rain hammered against the window as the two stared at each other, suspended in a moment that felt like a held breath. "You shouldn't be in here," he said softly, but the softness did not mask the threat beneath. "I was told to collect linens," she replied, steadying her voice. Jonah stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You see too much, Evelyn." He tapped his notebook with one finger. "And people who see too much don't last long in this house." He spoke the words as if stating a rule, an old and familiar one. But then something flickered in his eyes. Not malice, not exactly. Something closer to worry. Or guilt. Before she could decipher it, he turned abruptly and left, closing the door behind him. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The documents burned in her mind. Jonah's warning echoed like a prophecy. Somewhere downstairs, Thomas was shouting again. Nathaniel was drinking with the windows open despite the storm. Samuel paced the hallway outside her room for so long she finally heard Charles hiss, "Go to bed, boy." And Evelyn understood something terrifying. Whatever was unraveling inside that house, she was now part of it, woven into the very fabric of their secrets. She could only wonder how long the threads would hold before snapping. The days that followed unfolded with the slow, relentless pressure of a tightening noose. The storm had passed, but the house did not feel lighter. It felt as though the walls had absorbed the tension, holding it inside their wooden ribs. Even the air seemed to listen. Evelyn moved through her duties with measured precision, aware of every gaze that followed her. The Wentworth sons no longer behaved like individuals with their own whims and tempers. They moved as though bound by a shared anxiety, an invisible thread pulling them all toward some impending reckoning. Nathaniel was the first to show the strain. His charm slipped like peeling paint. He still approached Evelyn with that too-easy smile, but there was something frantic beneath it, something desperate. His requests became demands. His comments tasted like threats dressed in velvet. When she served breakfast one morning, he leaned too close and whispered, "A house like this needs someone who knows how to keep a secret." She didn't answer, but he seemed satisfied simply to see her flinch. Thomas was worse. He drank before noon now, the sour smell of whiskey traveling with him like a shadow. He muttered about men coming soon and father's damn pride. Once she heard him shouting at Charles through a closed door, words slurred but sharp enough to cut. "You'll destroy all of us. You think you can hide this forever?" The silence that followed was more frightening than the outburst. Jonah kept writing, always writing, filling his leather notebook with lines Evelyn could not understand but could sense were dangerous. He watched her with an intensity that felt like scrutiny, but not hatred. Perhaps it was suspicion, or perhaps it was fear of what she now knew. But it was Samuel who troubled her most. The youngest son had always been quiet, but now he seemed ghost-like, drifting through hallways, lingering by windows as though listening for something outside. Sometimes he spoke to Evelyn as if they were equals, small fragments of truth slipping through the cracks of his family's secrets. "They think loyalty is something you can force," he said once as she polished the brass railing near the staircase. "But fear isn't loyalty, not really." She turned slightly. "You should be careful saying such things." Samuel offered a faint, sad smile. "I'm careful all the time. That's the problem." Then he walked away, leaving her with a chill. The house prepared for Christmas as though clinging to ritual could prevent collapse. Garlands were hung, candles placed in windows, the dining room set with silver that had belonged to the family long before the war. But there was no warmth to the preparations, only obligation. Each decoration felt like a performance staged for ghosts. One evening, while retrieving linens for the holiday guests who would never actually be invited, Evelyn found the master bedroom door halfway open. Inside, Charles sat alone at his desk, shoulders hunched, hair disheveled. He didn't notice her at first. His hands shook as he opened a drawer and removed a document she recognized instantly, one of the forged deeds. He stared at it with something between dread and fury. "They think they can take everything from me," he whispered to the empty room. "But I will not bow, not to Washington, not to traitors, not to anyone." Evelyn froze. His voice had the feverish tone of a man cornered. Then abruptly he looked up, directly at her. "How long have you been standing there?" His voice cut through the dimness. "Just now, sir," she replied, though even saying the words felt dangerous. Something in his expression shifted. Suspicion, calculation, and something darker. "You will help prepare the parlor tomorrow," he said, his tone flattening. "We must present an image of dignity. Even decay must be polished clean." She nodded quickly and left before he could ask anything more. But as she stepped into the hallway, she saw Jonah at the opposite end, holding his notebook loosely, his eyes fixed on Charles's door with a look of grim understanding. He closed the book slowly, as though sealing away a truth he was not ready to face. That night sleep would not come. The air in her small room felt too tight, as though pressing against her chest. The moonlight from the window stretched long shadows across the floorboards, shifting with every movement of the trees outside. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house. Creaking wood, muffled footsteps, distant murmurs. Her mind raced. The forged documents, the muttered arguments, the fear in Jonah's voice, the desperation in Nathaniel's smile, the sadness in Samuel's eyes, and then, the most unsettling realization of all. Every one of them seemed to sense that she stood at the edge of their family's unraveling, as though her very presence had become a catalyst. It was shortly before dawn when Evelyn heard something new. Not footsteps, not whispers. A sound like fabric tearing. A soft thud. And then, silence. So complete it felt intentional. She sat up in bed, pulse quickening. For the first time since arriving at the Wentworth mansion, she had the distinct feeling that someone, or something, was moving toward a decision that could not be undone. Christmas Eve arrived with a strange, weightless quiet. The kind that precedes a storm not of weather, but of human intent. The morning air in Savannah was unusually cold, the kind that made breath visible and footsteps sharper. Frost clung to the edges of the windows, and the light that filtered through them was pale, diffused, almost spectral. The mansion felt suspended between worlds, holding its breath. Evelyn rose before dawn, compelled by restlessness rather than obligation. She dressed slowly, listening. The house was usually bustling before sunrise, but now it was still, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The previous night's sounds and the soft rip, the muted thud, haunted her, though she had found nothing when she walked the hallway in the darkness, searching for the source. By mid-morning, the Wentworth family had descended into their usual holiday rituals, or their attempts at them. The parlor smelled of pine and wax, though neither scent managed to soften the tension clinging to the air. Charles sat by the fireplace in a velvet armchair, staring into the flames with a look that suggested he feared they might someday turn on him. Nathaniel paced near the window, hands behind his back, muttering to himself. Thomas drank openly from a silver flask, ignoring the disapproval etched across Jonah's face. Samuel, quieter than ever, hovered near the staircase. Evelyn moved silently among them, lighting candles, adjusting garlands, carrying trays of spiced cider. They barely acknowledged her presence, but she could feel their eyes following her in fragments. A glance from Nathaniel, a prolonged stare from Jonah, a flicker of something unreadable in Charles's expression. She noticed something else, too. Every one of them seemed altered, not visibly but subtly. A shift, a quiet descent. When she passed the dining room, she found the long wooden table set for dinner, each place arranged meticulously, each piece of silver polished to a mirror sheen. But the chairs remained empty. The room felt staged, like a photograph of a celebration rather than the celebration itself. Around noon, Charles summoned his sons to the study. Evelyn was close enough in the hallway to hear the first few words before the door shut behind them. "Tonight must be perfect," Charles said. "Appearances matter. Even now, especially now." Then the door closed, sealing away whatever fear or anger lay inside. Evelyn exhaled slowly and returned to her work. But as she reached the end of the hall, she noticed a faint trail of something on the floor, a line of dark droplets nearly invisible against the wood. She crouched, tracing them with her eyes. They led toward the rear staircase. Not wine, not ink. Blood. Barely enough to be alarming to anyone but someone capable of reading omens in silence. She rose quickly, wiping her hands on her apron as she followed the trail upward. The rear staircase was narrow and dim, lit only by small slits of windows. The droplets continued to the second floor, then to a small storage room she had rarely seen used. The door was ajar. Inside, the air felt colder. A single candle flickered on a crate, casting thin shadows on the walls. And in the corner, half hidden behind an old trunk, lay a torn piece of fabric, part of a shirt sleeve, stained with blood. Too fine to belong to a servant. too familiar in pattern. She recognized it instantly. Thomas's shirt. A floorboard creaked in the hallway behind her. Evelyn turned sharply, but no one was there. Only the faint echo of movement somewhere deeper in the house. The heavy footfall of a man trying and failing to be quiet. She extinguished the candle and slipped out, heart pounding, careful not to touch anything that might reveal her presence. Whatever had happened in that room, the family was hiding it, or perhaps hiding from it. Back downstairs, the afternoon light began to fade. The mansion filled with the low hum of preparations, dishes arranged, firewood stacked, lanterns lit. Yet beneath the routine lay a tremor, a growing unease that threaded itself through every action. As evening approached, the family gathered in the parlor for their customary toast. Evelyn stood near the doorway, ready to serve drinks. Charles raised his glass, but his hand trembled slightly, a detail his sons pretended not to see. "To survival," Charles said. "Not to joy, not to peace. To survival." The glasses clinked, the sound thin and brittle. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas was there among them, smirking lazily, as if nothing were amiss. Yet she knew what she had seen upstairs. The blood, the torn sleeve. His eyes gleamed with something sharp, something volatile. And then, as she collected the empty glasses, her gaze brushed against Jonah's. He held her stare longer than usual, his notebook nowhere in sight. But his expression told her everything she needed to know. The house was already in motion. Whatever had been set into place, whatever decision had been made, it was far too late to stop it, and the night was only just beginning. Night settled over Savannah with the hush of falling snow, a rare, unsettling gift from the sky. The flakes drifted past the windows of the Wentworth mansion like silent witnesses, softening the world outside, while everything inside sharpened to a dangerous edge. Christmas Eve had always been a performance for the family, but this year the script had unraveled, leaving only instinct, fear, and something darker guiding their movements. Evelyn felt it the moment the clock struck 7. The air changed, pulled tight, charged like a storm waiting for its first crack. She stood at the threshold of the dining room, hands steady though her heartbeat thrummed in her throat. The table was set, candles flickering with an almost unnatural stillness, as though even the flames were wary of disturbing the atmosphere. The Wentworth men entered one by one. Charles, stiff-backed, jaw locked, carrying the authority of a man who still believed he could rule over chaos. Nathaniel, lips curved into a brittle smile, pupils dilated in a way that betrayed fear beneath charm. Thomas, pale despite the alcohol in his blood, his left sleeve carefully buttoned down, hiding what Evelyn already knew. Jonah, quiet, ink smudges still staining his fingers, though there was no notebook in sight. And Samuel, the only one who looked human tonight, haunted, observant, already mourning something that had not yet happened. Dinner began in silence. Knives touched plates with delicate restraint. Wine was poured without conversation. The only sound was the occasional pop from the fireplace, loud enough to make more than one of the brothers flinch. Evelyn moved between them with ghost-like grace, refilling glasses, replacing dishes, careful not to meet their eyes for too long. But they watched her, each for their own reason, and she watched them back, though none of them realized it. Halfway through the meal, Charles lifted his glass. "This family," he said, "has endured humiliation, deceit, and betrayal. But tonight we move forward. Tonight we reclaim ourselves." Evelyn felt the words like a blade grazing her skin. Nathaniel raised his glass as well, but his hand shook. "To Father," he muttered, "and to doing what must be done." Jonah looked away sharply. Thomas drank too much, too fast. Samuel swallowed hard, staring at his plate as though wishing he could disappear into it. The tension grew until it became a living thing in the room. Then the first cough broke the silence. Nathaniel pressed a hand to his throat, blinking as though surprised. Another cough followed, deeper, sharper. His glass slipped, red wine spilling across the pristine tablecloth like a spreading wound. "What?" he choked, standing abruptly. Thomas pushed back his chair as well, gripping the table for balance as his breath hitched. His face reddened, then drained of color. He stumbled, knocking over silverware. Charles stood next, fury flashing across his features. What have you? His words dissolved into a violent spasm. Only Jonah and Samuel remained seated, frozen in terror as they watched their father and brothers convulse. And Evelyn did not move. It happened quickly, much more quietly than the stories would someday claim. There were no screams, only gasps, no dramatic collapses, only the soft thud of bodies failing under the weight of their own corruption. When the room finally stilled, only Jonah and Samuel were conscious, breathless, shaking, alive. Charles lay slumped in his chair, head bowed as though in reluctant prayer. Nathaniel had collapsed near the window, one hand reaching toward the falling snow he would never touch. Thomas lay on his back, eyes open but unseeing. The air smelled of pine, candle smoke, and something metallic. Jonah was the first to speak, voice breaking. It wasn't us. It wasn't... Samuel, we didn't... His gaze lifted to Evelyn. He didn't finish the sentence. Samuel looked at her too, tears streaking his face. Not an accusation, but an understanding. Evelyn met their eyes with a calmness that felt ancient. Not triumphant, not remorseful. Something in between. A quiet acknowledgement of what had been required to survive a house built on cruelty. You should leave, she said softly. Jonah staggered to his feet, dragging Samuel with him. Neither asked questions. Neither demanded explanations. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud. When the front door finally closed behind them, the mansion fell into complete silence. Snow gathered on the porch. Candles flickered low, and Evelyn stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by the broken remains of a legacy that had tried, and failed, to consume her. She exhaled slowly. For the first time since arriving at the Wentworth estate, the house felt still in a way that wasn't threatening. The air was her own. The silence was her own. The night outside was cold, but not cruel. And somewhere deep within the empty halls, a floorboard creaked, as though the house itself were exhaling at last. If this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, comment below what shocked you the most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves dark stories from America's past.